Right. Has the number of participants joining sort of slowed down, Colin?
It has. We're at 64,
Okay.
and it seems to be pretty stable at 64 now.
Okay. In that case, as I think we advertised a 4 o'clock start, I think that's probably good to get off to a start. I'm welcome to the first of these recovery convention discussions, webinars, seminars, what we want to call them. My name's Simon Linford. I'm hosting this afternoon, but I'm not going to be hosting very many of these. Basically, a different host is hosting each one, depending either on personal interest or particular level of appropriateness for them. I mean, as you probably realise, a lot of effort has gone into producing this series. So it's good to see so many people here. I mean, most of these presentations have got sort of 100 plus people registered, which is fantastic. So I'm hosting this, but in terms of my hosting duties, it's really only introducing the speakers and keeping things moving, and realizing maybe when we've come to the end. Colin Newman is behind the scenes in a technical host role in case we get stuck, although we shouldn't. I don't think we should, because this presentation doesn't involve PowerPoint or anything. Our guest speakers are just talking to us, which should make it easier. If you want the speaker to appear in the middle of your screen, if you go into your speaker mode, so you just see the speaker and then everyone else becomes small. Otherwise, you just see everybody and you might not actually see the speakers. Hopefully, if you're not speaking, if you just stay muted. If you want to speak, the speakers who I'll introduce, they're quite happy for this to be a quite open discussion. They want to stimulate debate rather than talk at us for 45 minutes and take questions at the end. So we'll keep an eye on, if you know how to put your hand up with the Zoom control, do it that way. If that's not working, wave your hand wildly, and if that's not working, unmute yourself and say oi. And if you do that, we'll unmute you or ask you to unmute, and then ask the question or just make a point from your own experience. I'm sure that'll be very welcome today as well. And it's noted it is recording, so if you don't want your to appear in a recording, or if you've told someone else that you're somewhere else, just turn your camera off. So the subject of our discussion this afternoon, building better relationships with your church. Very pleased that we've been joined by members of the Guild of Clerical Ringers, 2 speaking and a couple of others lurking in the background, so I'm sure we'll chip in. Good to have them, of course, because they've got a foot in both camps in this discussion. I think a feature of lockdown, certainly from my perspective, has been that I think the church and bell ringers have been brought closer together. I think we've all realised perhaps what we mean to each other. We've had plenty of instances of it being pressure from the clergy asking to get bells ringing again, rather than what seems to be the usual one of bell ringers badgering the clergy to have more opportunity to ring. So it's good that we're recognised, and I think we've all noticed as well how bells are one of the sounds that's been missed in our communities. So I'm going to hand over first of all to Reverend Max Drinkwater, who's a ringer, as members of the Clerical Guild of Ringers are. He's vicar of Haverhill in Suffolk, and he's going to be joined by Tony Ellis, who is president of the Guild of Clerical Ringers. So Max, I'll hand over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Simon, and thank you for this opportunity to come together. Yeah, very much for a discussion and a debate, and just to see really how we as a group feel relations between the church and ringing are at the moment, and how we could build those going forward. We, Tony and I, are here sort of on behalf of the Guild of Clerical Ringers, and the first thing I want to do is hand over to Tony to just say a little bit about the Guild and how we want to shape ourselves going forward, and offer ourselves as a resource really to both the church and ringers. So Tony, over to you.
Thank you, Max, and thank you for asking me to do this and for giving the Guild a chance to advertise itself, rather. We've been around for a long time, about 80 years, and what we did for about 80 odd years was just to meet up for a ringing tour somewhere in the weeks after Easter to try and recover from all the pressures of Holy Week and Easter. But some years ago, we realized that we had to be a little more energetic and try and put something back into ringing. We're told by some that ringers and clergy do not know each other as well as they did, certainly when I started ringing in the 1950s. But I'm a ringer first, and I was ordained when I'd been ringing for about 10 or 12 years anyway. So I'm a ringer first who is ordained. And most of us in the Guild probably learned to ring before we were ordained. So we've had a foot in both camps for a very long time. But some of us know too how the church works. A number of us have had posts of really considerable responsibility in the church, and I think are in a particularly good place to help ringers when things are not always as harmonious with church as they ought to be. I've sometimes wondered if it is just an urban myth that ringers in church don't get on as well as they once did. Sometimes excellent relations are excellent, sometimes, well, perhaps not so. But what we want to dwell on today is not on bad relationships, but on how they can be better. And actually, we'd like to know examples of good practice and how well some ringers get on with the local clergy and vice versa, of course. The Guild really does want to make a very positive contribution to the way ringing is working. We began to think about this a few years ago when we were trying to work out where God fitted into ringing. I guess that's a rather grand way of saying this is that we want to develop a theology of ringing, but that is still work in progress at the moment. One of the first things we did is we surveyed our membership about 4 years ago, and just to see how they were getting on with their local ringers. The results were interesting, they were varied, but generally I got the impression that things were fairly good in most areas. And that was a beginning. And we had quite a good response from our membership. Then a couple of years ago, when the Central Council met at Lancaster, 2 of our members turned up and led a seminar really working on the relations between church and ringers. I'm told it was a very positive encounter where we discovered that there were a good number of ringers who are very much part of their local church life. Well, after that experience, we realized that after avoiding joining the Central Council for 80 years, it was possibly time that we applied for membership. And last year, the Zoom meeting, we were allowed to have a representation on the council. And we're very glad about that, because I think it's important that somebody who is ordained ought to be on the Central Council. I remember in my youth, there used to be lots of clergy on the Central Council, but that's no longer the case. And so it's important, I think, somebody from the ordained ministry is present at the Central Council, because like it or not, church and ringing are absolutely tied together. Last year, we were asked to put a sort of a document together, really sort of outlining and explaining various terms that are used in the church. I know it's available on the Central Council website, but people tell me it's not easily found. I've got a copy of it here, and if anybody would like to see it, please let us know, and we'll get a copy to you, or tell you where you can find a copy if you can't find it on the Central Council website. But we've got it, and we're very happy to share it with other people. I suppose we've moved on since then, and during this lockdown period, we've continued to think about how we can serve the wider ringing community as a group of clergy. We've got a current project on at the moment, which is very much linked to what's going to be on our new website. But what we're looking at is various questions about ringing, a whole list of things about why do people ring bells? Talking about ringing as a really a public performance, and something that has to be done with higher standards, all sorts of ideas. And we want to look at the reason why how the Guild can support ringing, make it easier for ringers to access the church authorities, and just really to help ringers deal with church. And actually to show that most clergy are human beings, and ringing clergy are, really enjoy their ringing and have a great deal in common with all ringers, really. We're going to encourage presence of clergy on local guilds and associations, all sorts of other things. But we also want to point out that ringers too can be a great help to church and to clergy. I well remember how much I was helped by the local ringers when I was incumbent at Kidlington near Oxford, by the local band of ringers. They were the ones who always pointed out faults in the spire before any architect ever got word of it. And I've always been terribly grateful for ringers for that kind of really practical advice. But what we're hoping to do today, I hope, is to have a conversation as to how ringers and church can work together. I hope we're going to hear about the many good practices there are going on already. I don't really want, I hope it's not going to be a bitching session when we say how awful some churches are. I know that does happen. I'm realistic about that. But I think we get far further forward when we emphasize the positive and not the negative. When we completed our project of putting this document together, we hope it's going to have lots of examples of good practice. But we want to use this document as something that helps the whole ringing community in relations with church. And the bottom line is simply this: we're a group of ringers who are ordained, who want to make sure that there are good and harmonious relationships between ringers and church, and we want to benefit everybody involved. As an introduction to what the Guild of Clerical Ringers is all about at the moment, I hope that sort of kicks it off rather.
Thank you, Tony. Yes, we're definitely here as a resource. We're not here to preach or to tell you how you should do things. We're here as a resource, hopefully, people who know how things work a little bit in both sides of the story. This session has been titled Building Relations, Good Relations with Your Church. And so I wondered if it would be helpful to start with just to think a little bit about what we mean by church. And I say that because the church, I think, is going through a process of rediscovering what we mean by church. And from your point of view, I want to emphasize that you are the church. You're not on the fringe of the church or a part of the church. You are the church. Anybody who has a role to play in the community centered on a place of worship is a part of the church. The Church of England famously doesn't have a membership system. We have all sorts of ways that we show our identity and our belonging to the community, but we don't have such thing as a membership list. And so we all, as ringers, have our part to play in the life of that community. And I say that because when we're talking about issues such as church closure, which may well come up, what we mean by church closure would be the complete cessation of any community activity centered on a place of worship. But if there's ringing, then there's church activity. And there are a number of examples of churches who have used bell ringing as a focus for keeping the church going, keeping activity going at some of our centers of worship. And so I think it's helpful just to think a little bit about what we mean by church and how we can be a part of that, even though we might not be baptized, we might not attend worship regularly, although I'm sure many of us do. We might not be on the electoral roll or pay subscriptions, but we are all still a part of that community, a part of that church. As I say, the church is going through a process of re-understanding what we mean by church. And that process is happening slightly differently across the country. So different dioceses, and if you need to know what they are, we can talk about that, do things differently. So different parts of the country may well have a slightly different story to tell. So hopefully we can give you some pointers and resources for how to engage with your local community, the sorts of questions to ask, the sorts of things you might need to know. So we want to open the floor up really to you to say, what's going well? What do you need to know? What questions do you need to ask? What have you found are the frustrations and the difficulties? And as Tony said, he will be bringing together some of these into a wider resource that can be shared later on. But I'm here and other members of the Guild are here just to field some of your thoughts and questions and to respond and bring those together as best we can. So you've got the raise hand reaction, which should send you to the top of our screens. You can wave at us, let us know what you're thinking.
Vivian Nobbs has put her hand up, I think. Is she waving at us?
Vivian.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Hello, yes.
Ah, hello. Well, that was a great introduction. Thank you, Tony, and some good wise words to get us going from Max, I think. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Viv Nobbs, down south on the Isle of Wight, and part of the W&P Guild. And currently I'm the Public Relations Officer, and I have served a short period of time as Master some years ago. So just a few very positive reflections from me, if it helps to kickstart this afternoon. And I'll go back to the Central Council meeting at, the annual conference down at Portsmouth some years ago when I was Master, and the Vice Master who supported me so very well was Christine. Yeah, so that drew together a huge amount of local interest in the area, not just the church and the cathedrals, Portsmouth Cathedral and obviously Winchester that we were working with to some extent as well, but also the communities. And we had a great session there overall. But what really came out of that was the Bishop of Portsmouth, who's just recently retired, obviously was invited to the dinner, and he attended also with the Lord Mayor of Portsmouth. And we had a huge amount of support from Portsmouth Diocese generally. We kept them in the loop as to what was going on for lots of reasons, as we did with the Mayor's office as well. And as a direct result of that Central Council visit, and I say this quite often because obviously the Central Council can get in a bit of bashing now and again, as a direct result of that, we've had ongoing support from both dioceses, but particularly Portsmouth and their publicity guy. To the extent that, you know, if we send off a press release, which I'm about to do now, they're very likely to work it in not only to their diocesan website, but also circulate it to all the churches in the diocese, whether there are bells there or not. So this raising awareness of ringing generally is absolutely fabulous, absolutely fabulous. But going back a little while before that, when I was elected master, I made a point of contacting both bishops and saying, can I have a brief interview with you, please? And just to meet up with them both, talk about the missions of the diocese to some extent, and see where there were some common denominators that we could work on. Not great things happened straight away, but having that assurance that they were there for me and for us as a guild was wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. Being able to ring up or just, you know, send off an email when you've met the person and they've met you and they've heard what we're trying to achieve in ringing, it was really a good base to start from. So some very positive stuff indeed, I would say, and I would highly recommend that sort of consolidation, if you like, to start with a long-term view. I mean, I'd love to have achieved a lot more in 3 years than I did, but you know, you can set the ball rolling. We had an action plan that we set up and so forth, and that support from the diocese is still there in Portsmouth, and we're regaining it in Winchester. So hopefully that's helpful.
Thank you, Vivian. That's really good to hear. And I wonder if it's helpful just to say a little bit about what a diocese is and how it operates. I expect many of you are familiar with the term because in ringing, our associations tend to be parallel with Church of England dioceses. In the Church of England, a diocese covers about the same area as a county, is headed by the bishop, and has its own sort of management and organisational structures. And in the Church of England, each diocese actually has quite a lot of autonomy, certainly in terms of how it runs, how it takes its decisions, and how it communicates. And a lot of the activity in the Church of England is focused around the diocese. You'll have diocesan strategies and vision statements and mission statements. You'll have all sorts of other ways that the diocese tries to communicate and make sure that all the churches within that diocese are singing to the same hymn sheet. So although it's great that you know, we've got the Central Council and the Recovery Group talking to the Church of England's groups, I think a lot of the real work will happen at the next level down, because each diocese will decide on its own how to implement any decisions that come from higher up. And so when Vivian's talking about her local association speaking to the diocese, I think that's going to be a really important relationship going forward. And I think that will be key to understanding how each diocese views patterns of ministry and church activity, because each diocese will be different. So if you've got the opportunity, I would really encourage that conversation to happen on a diocese association level as well as on a local level. So it's really good, Vivian, to hear that some of that is happening and some really positive stories there. I'll also acknowledge Vicky's left a comment about ringing at a cathedral rather than a village church, and how you get heard and acknowledged by the chapter. A cathedral is run slightly differently to a parish church, and the chapter is the governing body of the cathedral. But I think the route in, if you like, is the same, whether you're in a cathedral or a large urban parish church or in a rural church, is identifying a key person on the local level who might be the priest in charge, the vicar, the incumbent. In a cathedral, that equivalent is the dean, but they're likely to be busy and pulled in all sorts of different directions. Particularly at a cathedral, the dean will have all sorts of people clamoring for her or his attention. And so there may well be somebody else who can be your route in, somebody else to court. In a rural setting, there's likely to be somebody with a responsibility to lead a local village congregation, and it might not be the vicar. In a cathedral, there's likely to be an outreach officer or a canon pastor, somebody who has responsibility for the groups that use that space. So Vicky, I'd say look for somebody who can be your go-to person who can make that link with the chapter.
Max, do you think there's possibility of or benefit of organising ringing at the next level down? I know the part of the Truro Dustin Guild is now looking at organising, rather than have the branches structure that they might have had in the past, but aligning groups of towers with a deanery.
Yes, so each diocese will be divided into deaneries, which again are a way of bringing local church activity together. And the deanery is a little bit of a nebulous construction. Some deaneries work very well together and support each other. Some deaneries have very little to do with each other. So again, it will depend on how your local deaneries operate. Here in Suffolk, which is a rural diocese, I think the deaneries are going to be very important units, because a lot of resources will end up being shared across a deanery. You may well have a deanery choir, you may well have a deanery ministry team. To be honest, it will end up going that way, that the ministry team could well cover the whole area of a deanery. And so to have a deanery-wide ringing band may well not be a bad idea. Certainly conversation around that area. I think the deanery could well become a very important local unit as churches share more resources and work collaboratively in the local area.
Okay, thank you. We've got two hands up. First of all, we got Annie Hall, and then Fred Bone in that order, if you could.
Thank you, Annie.
Thank you, Max, and thank you, Tony. I thought your introduction was super, and it was so nice to hear us called part of the church. And I know sometimes on a Sunday morning I hear people say, I've done my worship, I'm going home now. But my question, I suppose, is a controversial one. The church now insists that we do the safeguarding qualifications, rightly so, got no problems with that. But do you think the church should also say, to be tower captain, you need to be a regular church attender?
That so you've identified two issues there, but it seems to come down to what do we mean by being a part of the church? And to some extent that will vary depending on the ideas that your local incumbent has and your local PCC has. I do know that there would be various vicars who would see the ringers as part of the worship team, and therefore they would want to see some commitment, I suppose, to that in terms of church worship. I am very much of the mind that, as you say, if you've taken part in worship, done your bit, you worship how you want to, and you engage with the life of the community as you want to. I think by having that good relationship, by speaking to the vicar or whoever it is that's insisting that you attend, you're coming to a mutual understanding of how you want to engage with church life. Part of that shared space and shared life is about safeguards, is about wanting to know that you're committed to the same values as the church. And so I think asking that you attend worship is probably just part of that broader desire to know that we're all moving in the same direction. And yeah, some of that will require legal commitments to safeguarding and other things, and some of that will just be about wanting to offer you that opportunity to take part in other things going on in the church.
Thank you, Max. That's great. Annie? Yeah, it does. It's a really, I like the way that you said about direction of travel and making sure that it was really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, I think, and a lot of clergy may not know how you feel, and may not know that you feel that your ringing is part of your act of worship, and so invite the clergy, whoever it is, to see that and to be a part of that as well. Perhaps it's worth saying, I know of other towers where the clergy will come up and perhaps say a prayer before ringing, something like that. So if they're insisting you come down into church, perhaps you could insist they come up into the tower.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Annie. I think it was Fred next.
Fred next, and followed by Claire Lemary and then Joy Pluckrose.
Yes, thank you for everything so interesting so far. I could just like to move back to the previous topic, which was the suggestion that we ought to reorganise our ringing around deanery structures. It all sounds all very fine and dandy, but if Chelmsford's anything to go by, it's not very stable. I think there have been at least 3 reorganisations of the deaneries in Chelmsford Diocese since we've been here. So if that's going to keep happening, I think that's a bit more frequent than we can undertake to reorganise our ringing associations.
Any comeback on that one from our clerical guild colleagues?
The stories that come out of Chelmsford Diocese speak for themselves. I have no personal knowledge of the diocese, and I perhaps ought to leave it at that, for fear of incriminating myself. The deanery ought to be a reasonably static unit. However, the church is obviously facing huge challenges in terms of supporting its own structures, parish churches, benefices, deaneries, and different dioceses will respond in different ways. And that, I think, is why it is so important to know the mind of your diocese and how they are going to approach things. So where I am in Suffolk is right on the border with Essex, and so there are churches in Chelmsford Diocese which border my parish, and they could be completely different organisations. Sometimes the way we operate is so completely different. And so, yeah, I would encourage you to speak to the diocese to say, is this pattern likely to stay fixed for some time? How do you see deaneries in the diocese working? And can we find anything comparable in how we want to encourage ringing? So I guess that's my response, Fred.
Okay, thank you.
Just
Just
I
before,
wasn't meaning to suggest it was anything other than necessary for reorganisations. It's just that they do happen.
they do change, yeah.
Yeah.
Just before moving on to Claire, Catherine Salters posted in the chat that the Suffolk Guild has been organised around deaneries for a number of years, and and you've flexed when they've changed. So yeah, there is experience of that. Claire Lemary, I hope I pronounced your surname right.
You have indeed, Lemary, yes, yes.
Lemary. Okay.
This is a little bit, well, first of all, I'd like to say thank you, Tony Ellis, for your introduction. I learnt to ring at Kidlington many years ago, and they were very welcoming then, except that it was an all-male band, and I was along with my friend, the first women I think they'd ever had in the tower. It was a bit of a shock to them. Glad to hear they're still friendly. Secondly, this is a little bit of a grouch. We rang for Easter Day, as I think some churches did, with my daughter and my two grandsons, my husband. We were able to form a little bubble and ring 5 bells. We then went to church, and the vicar very sweetly thanked the flower ladies and the choir and the dusters and all the rest of it. But was there a single mention of the ringers? I, with courage, took him up on this later by email, and he did apologise. So I hope we have mended this tactfully, and I'm hoping for better when we resume contact. But I suspect that this happens in many churches.
Thank you, Claire. Yes, I'm going to hand over to Tony on that one. Tony, you're on mute.
I couldn't agree with you more. It happens all the time. And one of the things when we put together our document in the future is a guide for how clergy should treat their ringers. And one of the things we will make sure is in there is make sure you thank the ringers and you take them seriously. You just don't take them for granted. And that's, I think, is absolutely vital.
Yes.
But also, I think there's always the opportunity for ringers to do their bit to make themselves more visible. Is, you know, every church has an annual report every year, and how many ringers forget to get their report into the church's annual report? And that's a really useful thing to do, because it does increase their visibility, and they, you know, people notice them that way.
Yes. Yes.
I think we've got to do it. You know, it's not just church getting it wrong. Sometimes ringers get it wrong as well, and we've got to work together.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Ringers, of course, are typically up a tower or behind a screen. There is often a physical separation, and we just have to acknowledge that, I think, and realise that we have to work hard to overcome it. There's also a temporal separation. We ring before the service rather than during it. So yeah, we just have to acknowledge those things, I think, and work over them. I think most clergy would not thank the ringers out of forgetting rather than deliberate omission. So it's a case of working to increase our profile. And as Tony says, with a foot in both camps, hopefully the Guild of Clerical Ringers can offer some resources to the church as well as to how to build this relationship, as well as coming from the ringers direction.
Okay, our next question is coming in from Joy Pluckrose, and then Viv's put her hand up another time. So just take Joy's question, then come back to Viv, and then I might ask a question about choir organist relationships.
Thank you. It's quite interesting what Max has just said, because part of this follows on from that. I just wonder, I have no intimate knowledge of how theological colleges work, but I just wonder whether when vicars are in training, whether they have any sort of module that introduces them to the sort of people they're likely to meet within their church and the groups, and whether having a module that introduces them to who these strange people are, who they are likely to find up their tower, because as has been said, many clergy just don't know what goes on in the tower. I've never been up a tower, despite the fact that you might invite them. And I just wonder whether this might be part of a theological college or a vicar's training, introduce, you know, sort of a module on who are your ringers and what are they likely to do.
Thank you. Thank you, Joy. Theological training is, again, something that is changing and being considered how that works. Training carries on too, and once clergy are ordained, there's a 3-year period approximately when you're still supervised and still expected to engage with training within your diocese. And that's often a time when the diocese will organise training sessions to meet key people in the diocese. And I know there are some dioceses where a representative from the Ringing Association has been a part of that, and ringing has been on the table as a part of the sort of introduction to the diocese. And I think that's a very good way of doing that, so that ringing and awareness of ringing could become a part of that second stage of training once you're in the parish and in the diocese. Tony, did you have something to say there as well?
Yes. A couple of years ago, well, about 10 years ago, somebody in Oxford approached the Wycliffe Hall Theological College, tried very hard to get in and influence, have a chance to talk to ordinands. It was met with a rebuttal, really. It was really unsuccessful. We don't think that we can do much with theological colleges. We've talked about this quite a lot as a guild. We think the important time is probably in first curacies, when people are in training. We think that is a time when curates become aware of ringing and all the opportunities, and frankly, you learn far more in your first couple of years in a parish than you probably did in a theological college anyway. The other thing is, very interestingly, I know Mark Reagan has been in contact with the Bishop of Worcester, and they are talking together about having a module or a training session where a local clergy ringer will come along and address non-ringing clergy. And Mark and John Ings, Bishop of Worcester, are talking about this, and I'm waiting to hear how this is going to develop after the lockdown is finished. But there is that would be a fantastic opportunity, and if that could happen in other dioceses, it would be so useful.
Viv, did you want to come back? I saw you waving a little bit earlier.
Yes, please. Yeah. My question number 1 has been admirably asked by Joy. Thank you very much. So that was great, and the responses have been very useful. So again, it points maybe to some more guild and association level discussions with the diocese, and yeah, and I think that last idea is a wonderful one, that the ringing clergy talking to a group of non-ringing clergy. So sorry, yes, that's right, non-ringing clergy. Yeah, That's wonderful. Thank you. Yeah, and as regards to the is the ringing part of worship, and many ringers I'm sure feel that way. Not rocket science, and it might be happening already, but you know, lockdown has given us a lot of opportunities that we would never have considered undertaking before. Is it possible, where churches have got a large screen in the church, that some of the ringing before or after the service could be being down into the church? That would really pull the ringers and the congregation together, wouldn't it? Might do a bit of recruiting as well.
Definitely, and I know there were sort of online services where the clergy would deliberately play recordings of the local bell ringers before the online service started. So yeah, I think there are some really good opportunities to use technology that we all seem to have become experts at now to our advantage.
There are lots of examples in the chat coming through of people who clearly do have good relationships with their clergy, inviting trainee curates to come along to a bringing practice, etc. Yeah. So on the general recruiting theme, I want to ask a question about choirs and organists. We are often, I think, competing for the same young person that we spot in the congregation. The organist rather hopes they can sing, and the ringing master rather hopes they're interested in the bells. And I know sometimes we don't have temporal separation, to use your lovely phrase, Max, in terms of the last minute choir practice when they're trying to pull the anthem together and the bell ringers. But so I'm just interested if any people here or have had examples of where the choir and the ringers have really worked together with the limited supply of young people in the church and been part of the same team, because it's something I'd quite like to try at my own church, where I've got my eye on a couple of the singers, but the organist will kill me.
I'll confess, I grew up ringing at a different church to the one I sang in the choir at. So and the services were at the same time. So every Sunday morning, I managed to escape from the tower at one church, fly up the road, robe and be in the choir at a different church before the service started. So it is possible. And but does anybody else have sort of examples of how the two can work perhaps more constructively and intentionally together?
Vicky said in the chat that choir at Chelmsford used to send young boys whose voices were about to break up the tower. Yeah, that's certainly when the first church I sang in the choir at, you became a bell ringer when your voice broke if you didn't end up singing alto or tenor. Any other examples? Oh, we've got a couple of hands have gone up. We've got Claire LeMarie again, followed by Janet Carr. Claire first.
Mine is just a very quick one, that I used to be in the choir, as did almost my entire band of ringers, in our ground floor ring where we rang around the font, and we just stopped 5 minutes early, went to the vestry, robed up and processed down the aisle as choir members. We did both, and we were always much appreciated, and it was mostly the youngsters in both things. Yes.
Quillis has made Roth has made a good point that Washington Cathedral, the ringing is after the service, and actually you could that is one way of doing it. Yes. Janet Carr is the next point.
Hello. Yes, I'm a ringer in Nottinghamshire, and I have to say, listening to the other participants, our experience in this particular area is very different. It sounds like the church 30 or 40 years ago. We don't have choirs. We have an organist who actually is a bell ringer also at one of our churches, but we actually ring within two groups of churches, none of which currently have an incumbent. There's a group of 12 where there hasn't been an incumbent for 2 years, and our group in which we happen to live hasn't had an incumbent now for, well, effectively for nearly a year. And there's no church choir. We have quite a reasonable relationship as ringers with the church wardens, but what you're talking about is just completely different to our experience. I have to say, apart from not being thanked, I mean, that goes without saying. But I would be interested, I actually thought I would attend this because of the fact that we have really virtually no relationship with our church. We do what if we're asked. We often only learn about things by a process of osmosis. Certainly, we've never been asked directly by an incumbent to ring, as far as I can remember, in 10 or 11 years of ringing. My partner was actually district ringing master for 30 years. And I don't think he would ever recall, he sat here with me, I don't think he could ever recall being directly asked by a priest or an incumbent to ring. So our experience here in our part of Nottinghamshire is extremely different to what everybody else has already said. And that's why I'm attending, because we feel we don't have a relationship at all, really.
Thank you, Janet. Yeah, there's a couple of things there. The first is to say that actually a year's vacancy, 2 years vacancy, is not unusual anymore, because of the resources that the church has in deployment. That is only going to get more and more common, I think. And so more and more churches will be faced with this question. How do we build a relationship when there is no vicar? Because the vicar has obviously traditionally been that point, that focus to build the relationship. And so that goes back to what I was saying in response to one of the comments in the chat about finding the right person to speak to. Even if there's not a vicar, there will be things happening in the church, and somebody will be leading and coordinating those. It's probably a church warden. It might also be a lay reader, an ordained person who's not in the vicar's role. Overseeing it all will probably be the rural dean, who's the head of the deanery. But in the local setting, in the parish church, there will be people leading, but it may not be the vicar, it may not be anybody who's ordained. And so I think my encouragement to you is to say, well, that's okay if there is no vicar, or if the vicar isn't involved directly, then look for the person who is in that leadership role. And certainly what I'm seeing here in Suffolk is that the church is encouraging others, lay ministers, church wardens, and so on, to take up those leadership roles and to help be that guide and direction for the parish church.
I think, sorry, I was going to say, I think it's actually quite difficult. I appreciate what you're saying, but I think it's quite difficult when our experience, we're in where we live, we're in a group of 6 parishes, and actually the incumbent who left us was in fact the area dean as well. So there is only just now an area dean being appointed. But in the other group of parishes, it's actually 12 parishes. So there's a group, an area of 18 parishes that are adjacent to one another without a vicar. So those parishes are having to cope with the other demands on their time. And I know from my own experience, my daughter happens to be getting married, hopefully later this year. And she lives in the group of 12 parishes, and she's had an extremely difficult time to even get hold of the right person to deal with the marriage service in the church, in the village where she lives, and still hasn't really had proper contact because of COVID, and is sort of parachuting in another vicar for the service. but it's very difficult. It's difficult even to do something like get married.
It is.
So
And I think
like bell ringing, which is not seen as important, is even more difficult.
Yeah, but to organise something, or to say, you know, we want to put on, I don't know, a tower open day, or we want to have a ringing festival, that doesn't need a vicar. You can do that. And so what can you offer to say, yeah, we can ring before services, we can, yeah, we can offer something, and make that offer to the church warden or to the person who has that local knowledge as to whether
we do that. As I said earlier, we do have a good relationship with the church wardens at the churches where we ring.
Good.
But I think they feel a little bit lost as well.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And so my point was, and I don't want to labour it because obviously other people want to speak, my point was that there are quite a number of parishes where the possibility of building a relationship is much more difficult.
Yes, I appreciate this, because I'm same in rural Herefordshire as well. You're not, I don't think you're alone by any means in this.
No.
Thank you for that comment, Janet. I've got Clyde Whitaker next, and then Ian Bucknell was waving at us, so after Clyde. Yeah.
Thank you, Simon, and thank you, Tony and Max. It's a very, very interesting session. I think the two things that I'm kind of taking away at the moment are firstly the point you made about the critical relationship with the diocese and the critical role the diocese plays, and also the point that Viv was making about developing sort of soft power and gradually over time building good relationships, and then use, building up some of those credits in the bank and then sort of making use of them in future years. But where you've got an association or a guild where perhaps they haven't spent as much time and effort to nurture those relationships in the past, and maybe the relationship they have with their diocese over the last few years is kind of withered, it is sometimes difficult to kind of know where to start, because people are very busy, particularly people in influential positions in these organizations. I mean, certainly in London, I was interested in Hayley's comment as well about the idea of trying to find a way into diocesan organizations at the kind of middle level of the deanery. And certainly in London, we have archdeaconries, and we kind of realized that our association has got a tenuous relationship with the bishop, who is our patron, but who we hardly ever see. And then there are relationships at the very bottom between towers and different clergy, but some of those clergy are more or less interested in ringing. And we kind of realized that there was nothing in between. And certainly when you realize that each one of those archdeaconries in London is tied to a suffragan bishop, you've got quite a few levels of organization that we don't really have any contact with, that kind of lie in the middle. So I guess the question is, if you can put yourself in the shoes of perhaps an association or guild that for one reason or another have found that their relationship with their diocese has kind of withered a little bit over the last, 10 years or 20 years or so, and they want to try and kind of rebuild it, whose kind of doors would you start knocking on?
Shall I hand straight over to Vivian, who's waving her hand? Do you have a response?
I do, and I'm sorry if I'm taking more time, but Clyde, you're absolutely right. As a follow-up to the two bishops' meetings that I had, I was then trying to establish links of exactly how you're describing. I'd been encouraged by both bishops, and I tend to try, if we send out a press release like we're about to now, as I said just now, I then try to send to various levels, if you like, in the diocesan network. So I'd already started to almost invite myself very politely to have meetings with archdeacons, and I started off with my local one, the Archdeacon of the Isle of Wight. Had hoped to go on to the several on the mainland, but unfortunately I had some heavy caring responsibilities, so I had to say, sorry, I can't come to the appointments you very kindly offered me, but I managed to do email chats instead. And and also one of the suffragan bishops, I'm sure, if not more, and always had a lovely response, either by email or sometimes by personal letter. And you know, it's one of those things, it's a bit like having an open day. It's very difficult to quantify, especially quickly, what results you're getting. But it's all part and parcel of what I've heard various very eminent people at Central Council say. We are trying to raise the profile of ringing. Talk to the mayors when they come to civic occasions with ringing. Talk to anybody you can grab and say, when you go out to your schools, when you go out to this place or the other, please remember, we want some ringers. Please remember, kids love to ring. Did I send you the email about the National Youth Contest? Here's the photos, look at them, they're beaming. You know, all of this stuff, any opportunity possibly, ram it home nicely. But I think sometimes historically ringers expect the world to come to us in our towers, and this links up to something that I think Janet was referring to, and that's a deferential thing. It's not an arrogant, we don't want to talk to the church, but we almost sit there waiting to be asked. The world is changing, and I think we can afford to be far more proactive. And as one of our vicars at Ryde said, until he retired at least, be encouraged is that, you know, 2 words, go out there, just be encouraged. There's an awful lot going for us in ringing, especially now when we're about to open up, you know. So, yeah, Archdeacon's brilliant, Clyde, brilliant.
Thank you, Vivian. I think there's a really important point there about communications and media and press release. A lot of dioceses are upping their game in terms of internal communications, and the communications officer may well be a good point of contact for raising the profile. Just the same as we had a comment earlier about putting things in the parish magazine on a local level, getting those stories out there. Again, in the diocese, Clyde, there are often, it's often a challenge getting to the diocesan bishop. Often they are committed to national roles and actually spend a lot less time in the diocese than you might expect. So if you get sent off to a suffragan, that's no bad thing. The suffragan is often the one who has much more of a finger on the pulse of the life of the diocese. There may well also be a bishop's chaplain, or they're calling them all sorts of different things now, but somebody in that role, the bishop's chaplain, whose job it is really is to prioritize the bishop's diary and to bring things in front of the bishop that they think are important. So going through the bishop's chaplain, or whatever they're called in your particular diocese, may well be a good option as well. Having said that, if you email bishop@cofesuffolk.org.uk, it will probably land in the chaplain's inbox anyway. So just go for it. Email the bishop, write to the bishop, and somebody should pick it up and will point it in the right direction.
Thank you. Another question coming in from Ian Bucknell.
Okay, so I am tower captain at Bisley in Gloucestershire, a small village in the Cotswolds, and we have to be self-sufficient from a ringing point of view. I think we really, the point about proactivity is the most important. And I think the problem is that ringers underestimate their importance and their relevance. I've run it at Bisley for 40 years. I grew up in the village, so we've got strong relationships. We've got a big band. Although we've got eight bells, we've got over 20 ringers, or at least we did before lockdown. And the age range is from teenagers through to early 80s. We're very dynamic, we're very busy, we're very active. So from the vicar's point of view, we're a valuable resource. Various members of our band are involved in the choir or on the PCC. And so we are seen as being one of the dynamic elements of the church and a resource to support the church activities. And of course, we highlight our activities as well. And I'm sure that up and down the country, there's lots of churches with lots of bands where if only they promoted themselves and were proactive in terms of their relationship with the church wardens and the vicar, you would gain an awful lot of kudos, because your enthusiasm, your dynamism is sadly lacking in a lot of what we would consider church communities. So I think we misunderstand our power, if you like, and our potential, and what we can bring to the table. And of course, if you do promote yourselves in those ways, and if you are active in those ways, you're then better placed to ask for things back. And so I think we should stop underestimating our importance in the church community.
Yes, that's almost a perfect summary of the discussion there. Max, do you want to come back on that one?
Well, thank you, and that's very, very encouraging. And yeah, it goes back to where I started, really, with the church and seeing ringers as a valuable part of the community life and what's going on, and saying what can we offer, how can we play that part. So thank you, Ian, for that encouragement. That's really good to hear.
Yeah. We don't have any other questions lined up, and no one's. Oh, Jane, is that a question or a clap?
Can you hear me now? Right.
Yes.
I'm the Public Relations Officer for Truro, Diocese Guild of Ringers. So a long way away. When I want to send out a little message, I usually send a Cornish chuff. And it's been quite remarkable where this little chuff has arrived in the last few days, because I've just arranged for some ringing for Oxford Botanical Gardens' 400th birthday. Simply because by accident, I think they sent me an invitation to one of their do's. And I looked at it and thought, I can't resist this, campanulas and campanology and all of the links. So I rang somebody up and said, would you like some bells to ring for your 400th birthday? And they were so excited, and they're going to make a film of Magdalen College ringing and the Oxford bells. I had to bow out of the picture at that point because I'm Cornish, so I shouldn't really be interfering. But we happen to have a ringer at Truro Cathedral who is on the Ringing Society in Oxford. So that little chuff really did his homework. And it just happened so quickly, and everybody was so pleased. The other thing we've done recently is everybody has open studios when we haven't got COVID. But this year they're not going on, except down in West Cornwall, where we have got some really starving artists. And they decided they could hang their pictures on fences and hopefully the public would come over the bank holiday. So I got in touch with them and said, how would you like it if we did some ringing for you, just to tell people that you're open? And we're rather hoping that the starving artists will come and ring with us when they close down again for the season. And they were so excited. And we're on Radio Cornwall now, talking with starving artists and whatever. If you want to recruit people, somebody else that I've talked to, they'll come out in droves. It's called Extinction Rebellion. They would love to learn to ring. Not the people who sit on top of trains, so it's all right, Simon. We're not going to do anything that wicked, but just really nice people who live in my community, which is Liskeard, who feel really strongly about the environment and climate change, feel that they don't want to sit on top of trains, but they really would like to make a point. And I've looked at what the Bishop of Truro is saying, you know, about his policies, and he's very keen on the environment and things like that. So, you know, are we allowed to ring for that? I don't know. So it's the question I would ask, please, for some guidance. What is the reason that we ring bells? Thank you.
That's precisely what we're trying to think about as the Guild of Clerical Ringers. Why do we ring bells? And that's that. You know, we've got some thinking to do on that, and I hope by the end of the year we will have something to put to the ringing community on that.
Excellent. Okay. I'm going to bring this to a close because we've gone past the advertised time. I don't know if Max or Tony, you want to have a final summary up, or I'll sort of summarise a couple of thoughts I've noted down.
Well, if I can just say thank you to everybody for your contributions and for participating so openly and honestly. From our point of view, it's been a really good afternoon and an opportunity to hear from you, and I think it's going to help us to see where we can direct our resources in the future. If you've got other comments or queries, you can contact us directly. I can put an email address, info@guildofclericalringers.org.uk. I've just put that in the chat, so you can email stories, suggestions, questions there. There is a new website in development which should have more of our resources on offer at some point later this year, but it won't be ready for some time yet. I think that's fair, is it, Tony?
Yes, yes. I hope the info email address works anyway.
Yes.
Okay.
So thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. I think my two takeaways really are: I think if you're in a leadership position in a guild or association, then trying to build a relationship at diocesan level is good, and it might not be the bishop, it might be the bishop's chaplain, it might be someone different. And some dioceses are actually looking at having someone who does interface with ringers. So establish that connection, because things do happen at a diocesan level. And then if you're in a group of churches, the deanery in rural areas, particularly, the deanery might be a useful group. And if it's just your church, then get on the PCC and speak to people. And as Ian Bucknell said, don't underestimate our importance, because we are part of the church and we make a big noise. And I'm even going to speak to the organist tomorrow, see if we can share some choristers. Right. Thank you all for coming. Well, we'll stay on 5 minutes as people leave if anyone has a last comment. But thank you all, and hope to see you all at other events. Thank you.